The Screwtape Letters, Part 6, written by C.S. Lewis, starting at letter number 16. My dear Wormwood, you mentioned casually in your last letter that the patient had continued to attend one church and one only, since he was converted, and that he is not wholly pleased with it. May I ask you what you are about? Why I have no report on the causes of his fidelity to the parish church? Do you realize that unless it is due to indifference, it is a very bad thing? Surely you know that if a man can't be cured of church-going, the next best thing is to send him all over the neighborhood looking for the church that suits him until he becomes the tastier or a connoisseur of churches. The reasons are obvious. In the first place, the patriarchal organization should always be attacked, because, being a unity of place and not of likings, it brings people to different classes of psychology together in the kind of unity the enemy desires. The congregational principle, on the other hand, makes each church into a kind of club, and finally, if it all goes well, into a camaraderie or fraction. In the second place, the search for a suitable church makes the man a critic where the enemy wants him to be a pupil. What he wants of a layman in church is an attitude which may, indeed, be critical in the sense of rejecting what is false or unhelpful, but which is wholly uncritical in the sense that it does not appraise, does not waste time in thinking about what it rejects, but lays itself open in uncommenting, humble reprobity to any nourishment that is going. You see how groveling, how unspiritual, how unredeemably vulgar he is. This attitude, especially during sermons, creates the condition most hostile for our whole policy, in which platitudes can become really inaudible to the human soul. There is hardly any sermon or any book which may not be dangerous to us if it is received in this temper. So pray bestier yourself, and send this fool the round of the neighboring churches as soon as possible. Your record up to late has not given us much satisfaction. The two churches nearest to him, I have looked up in the office. Both have certain claims. At the first of these, the vicar is a man who has been so long engaged in watering down the faith to make it easier for a supposedly incredulous and hard-headed congregation, that it is now he who shocks his parishioners with his unbelief, not vice versa. He has undermined many a soul's Christianity. His conduct of the services is also admirable. In order to spare the laity of difficulties, he has deserted both the lectionary and the appointed psalms, and now, without noticing it, revolves endlessly round a little treadmill of his 15 favorite psalms and 20 favorite lessons. We are thus safe from the danger that any Jew not already familiar with him to be his flock should ever reach them through Scripture. But perhaps your patient is not quite silly enough for this church, or not yet. At the other church, we have Fr. Spike. The humans are often puzzled to understand the range of his opinions, why he is one day almost a communist, and the next not far from some kind of theoretic fascism. One day a scholastic, and the next prepared to deny human reason altogether. One day immersed in politics, and the day after declaring that all states of this world are equally under judgment. We, of course, see the connecting link, which is hatred. The man cannot bring himself to preach anything which is not calculated to shock, grieve, puzzle, or humiliate his parents and their friends. A sermon which such people could accept would be to him as insipid as a poem which they could scan. There is also a promising streak of dishonesty in him. We are teaching him to say the teachings of the church is when he really means, I'm almost sure I read recently a Narrating or some of that sort. But I must warn you that he has one fatal defect. He really believes. And this may yet mar all. But there is one good point which both these churches have in common. They are both party churches. I think I warned you before that if your patient can't be kept out of the church, he ought to at least be violently attached to some party within it. I don't mean on really doctrinal issues. About those, the more lukewarm he is, the better. It isn't the doctrines on which we chiefly depend on producing malice. The real fun is working up hatred between those who say Mass and those who say Holy Communion, when neither party could possibly state the difference between, say, Hooker's doctrine and Thomas Aquinas, in any form which would hold water for 5 minutes, and all their purely indifferent things, candles and clothes and whatnot, are an admirable ground for our activities. We have quite removed from men's minds what the pestilent fellow Paul used to teach about food and other essentials, namely, that the humans without scruples should always give in to the human with scruples. We should think they should not fail to see the application. You would not expect to find the low churchman manufacturing and crossing himself lest the weak conscience of his high brother should be moved to irreverence, and the high one refraining from these exercises, lest he should betray his low brother into idolatry. And so it would have been but for our ceaseless labor. Without that, the varieties of usage within the Church of England might have become a positive hotbed of charity and humility. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. My dear Wormwood, the contemptuous way in which you spoke of gluttony as a means of catching souls is your last letter only shows your ignorance. One of the great achievements of the last 100 years has been to deaden the human conscience on that subject, so that by now you will hardly find a sermon preached on a consciousness troubled about it in the whole length and breadth of Europe. This has largely been effected by consecrating all our efforts on gluttony of delicacy, not gluttony of excess. Your patient's mother, as I learned from the dossier, and you might have learned about Globtos, is a good example. She would be astonished. One day, I hope, will be too lean that her whole life is enslaved to this kind of sensuality, which is quite concealed from her by the fact that the quantities involved are small. But what do quantities matter, provided we can use a human belly and placiate to produce querulousness, impatience, uncharitableness, and self-concern? Globtos has this old woman well in hand. She is a positive terror to hostess and servants. She is always turning from what has been offered her to say with a demure little sigh and smile, "Oh, please, please. All I want is a cup of tea, weak but not too weak, and the tiniest, sweetest bit of crisp toast." You see, because she wants a smaller and less costly than what has been set before her, she never recognizes as gluttony. Her determined to set what she wants, however troublesome it may be to others. At the very moment of indulging her appetite, she believes that she is practicing temperance. In a crowded restaurant, she gives a little scream at the plate, which some overworked waitress has set before her, and says, "Oh, that's far, far too much. Take it away and bring me about a quarter of it." If challenged, She would say she was doing this to avoid waste. In reality, she does it because the particular shade of delicacy to which we have enslaved her is offended by the sight of more food than she happens to want. The real value of the quiet, unobtrusive work which Glubclose has been doing for years on this old woman can be gauged by the way in which her belly now dominates her whole life. The woman is in what may be called the all I want state of mind. All she wants is a cup of tea properly made, or an egg properly boiled, or a slice of bread properly toasted. But she never finds any servant or any friend who can do these simple things properly, because her properly conceals the insatiable demand of doing the exact, almost impossible, palatable pleasures which she remembers and imagines she remembers from her past, a past described by her as the days when you could get good servants, but known to us as the days when she senses were more easily pleased, and she had pleasures of other kinds which made her less dependent on these of the table. Meanwhile, the daily disappointment produces daily ill temper. Cooks give notice, and friendships are cooled. If ever the enemy introduces into her mind a faint suspicion that she is too interested in food, Glubclose counters it by suggesting to her that she doesn't mind what she eats herself, but does like to have things nice for her boy. In fact, of course, her greed has been one of the chief sources of his domestic discomfort for many years. Now your patient is your mother's son. While working your hardest, quite rightly, on other fronts, you must not neglect the little quiet infatuation in respect of gluttony. Being a male, he is not likely to be caught by the all I want camouflage. Males are best turned into gluttons with the help of their vanity. They ought to be made to think themselves of knowing about food, to critique themselves on having found the only restaurant in the town where steaks are really properly prepared. What begins as vanity can be gradually turned into a habit, but however you approach it, the great thing is to bring him into the state in which the denial of any one indulgence, it matters not which, champagne or tea, sorbet or cigarettes, put him out. For then his charity, justice, and obedience are all at your mercy. Mere excess in food is much less valuable than delicacy. Its chef use it as a kind of artillery for preparations for attacks or chastity. On that, as any other subject, keep your man in a condition of false spirituality. Never let him notice the medical aspect, keeping him wondering what pride or lack of faith has delivered him into your hands, when a simple inquiry into what he has been eating or drinking in the last 24 hours would show him whence your ammunition comes, and thus enable him by a very little abstinence or imperil your lines of communication. He must think of a medical side of charity. Feed him the grand line which he has made the English humans believe, that physical exercise in excess and consequent fatigue are especially favorable to his virtue. How they can believe this in face of the notorious lustfulness of sailors and soldiers may well be asked, but we use the schoolmasters to put the story about men who were really interested in charity as an excuse for games, and therefore recommend games as the aid to chastity. But the whole business is too large to deal with the tail end of a letter. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. My dear Wormwood, even under Slubgob, you must have learned the routine technique of sexual temptation, and since for us spirits, this whole subject is one of considerable tedium, through necessity as part of our training, I will pass it over. But on the larger issues involved, I think you have a good deal to learn. The enemy's demand on humans take the form of a dilemma, either complete abstinence or unmitigated monogamy. Ever since our father's first great victory, we have rendered the former very difficult to them. The latter, for the last few centuries, have been closing up as a way to escape. We have done this through the poets and the novelists, by persuading the humans that a curious and usually short-lived experience, which they call being in love, is the only respectable ground for marriage. That marriage can, and ought to, render this excitement permanent, and that marriage which does not do so is no longer binding. This idea is our parody of an idea that came from the enemy. The whole philosophy of hell rests on recognition of the axiom that one thing is not another thing, and specifically that one self is not another self. My good is my good, and your good is yours. What one gains, another loses. Even an inanimate object is what is by excluding all the other objects from the space it occupies. If it expands, it does so by thrusting other objects aside or by absorbing them. A self does the same. With beasts, the absorption takes the form of eating. For us, it means the sucking of will and freedom out of the weaker self into the stronger. To be means to be in competition. Now, the enemy's philosophy is nothing more nor less than one continued attempt to evade this very obvious truth. He aims at the contradiction. Things are to be many, yet somehow also one. The good of us self is to be the good of another. This impossibility he calls love. And this same monotonous panacea can be detected under all he does and even all he is, or claims to be. Thus he is not content even himself to be a sheer antithetical unity. He claims to be three as well as one, in order that this nonsense about love may find a foothold in his own nature. At the end of the scale, he introduces in the matter that obscene invention, the organism, in which the parts are perverted from their natural destiny of competition and made to cooperate. His real motive for fixing on sex as a method of reproduction among humans is only too apparent from the use he has made of it. Sex might have been, from our point of view, quite innocent. It might have been merely one more mode in which a stronger self preyed upon a weaker, as it is, indeed, among the spiders, where the bride concludes her nuptials by eating the groom. But in the humans, the enemies have gratuitously associated affection between the parties with sexual desire. He has also made the offspring dependent on the parents and given the parents an impulse to support it, thus producing the family, which is like the organism, only worse, for the members are more distinct, yet also united in a more conscious and responsible way. The whole thing, in fact, turns out to be simply one more device for dragging in love. Now comes the joke. The enemy described a married couple as one flesh. He did not say a happily married couple, or a couple who was married because they were in love. But you can make the humans ignore that. You can make them forget that the man they call Paul did not confine it to married couples, mere copulation. For him makes one flesh. You can thus get humans to accept as a rhetorical eulogies of being in love what were in fact plain descriptions of a real significance of sexual intercourse. The truth is that wherever a man lies with a woman, there, whatever they like it or not, a transcendental relationship is set up between them which must be eternally enjoyed or eternally endured. From the true statement that this transcendental relation was intended to produce, and if obediently entered into, too often will produce affection, and the family. Humans can be made to infer the false belief that the blend of affection, fear, and desire, which they call being in love, is the only thing that makes marriage either happy or holy. The error is easily produced because being in love does very often, in Western Europe, precede marriages, which are made in obedience to the enemy's designs. That is, with the intention of fidelity, fertility, and goodwill, just as religious emotion very often, but not always, attends conversion. In other words, the humans are to be encouraged to regard as a basis for holy marriage a highly colored and distorted version of something the enemy really promises as a result. Two advantages follow. In the first place, humans have not the gift of consciousness, can be deterred from seeking marriage as a solution because they do not find themselves in love, and thanks to us, the idea of marrying with any other motive seems them low and cynical. Yes, they think that. They regard the intention of loyalty to a partnership for mutual help, for the preservation of chastity, and for the transmission of life as something lower than a storm of emotion. Don't neglect to make your man think the marriage service very offensive. In the second place, any sexual infatuation, whatever so long as it intends marriage, will be regarded as love, and love will be held an excuse for man from all of his guilt, and to protect him from all other consequences of marrying the heathen, a fool, or a wanton. But more in this in my next. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.